Known interchangeably as a gas, a wheeze, scoundrel, Lothario, knave, scamp, scallywag, ne'er-do-well, quipster and a fop. Who is Boris Johnson, and why is he insisting I get an abortion? Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson was born in 1964, the love child of a Scrabble bag and a mop. His story truly began on the playing fields of Eton. It was there among these ivory towers that the boy, known as Al to his family, said, "No, my name is Boris now. You may not call me Al," much like a shit Paul Simon. He started cultivating a persona, that of a foppish cartoon buffoon, capable of charming everyone across the class divide. But of course he was at Eton, so this meant between the have-yachts and the have-two yachts. After Eton, we joined Boris at Balliol College, Oxford, where he studied less than rigorously and joined the infamous Drinking and Destruction Society, the Bullingdon Club. It was at Oxford and the Bullingdon Club where he cemented his friendship with future Prime Minister David Cameron. Together they were in the Bullingdon Club, but they studied separate degrees. Boris studied classics, Latin, Greek, fucking dead animals and smashing up restaurants, the classics. It was also at university that Johnson attempted to take cocaine. I say attempted, not because he was caught, but because instead of snorting it, he sneezed on it. I know it is confusing, Boris, but that's not why they call it blow. Since university, Johnson has married, divorced, married again, had 4 children with a second wife, 2 abortions with the mistress, and a love child with another. He's since been quoted boasting of not having to have a wank in 20 years, which is just depraved. I mean, Boris, they're your own children. But for a man who has endlessly betrayed all the women in his life, he still seems to think his word is worth a lot. Just wait until he finds out that liar is actually the lowest scoring 4-letter word. Straight out of uni, Johnson used his family connections to get a job at the Times. Viewing jobs like names, meaningless things your family give you, he quickly could not be bothered with the one that he had. Before he lasted a year, he had made up a quote, attributed it to his own historian godfather, got caught and got sacked. It's wonderful, seeing someone with so much privilege and education feeling the need to soil themselves for attention. Lovely schadenfreude. But Boris the hack wasn't done yet. Before long, he had blagged a job shitting in someone else's trousers. He moved to the Telegraph, dropping columns on the EU from their Brussels bureau. There, he spent 5 years fanning the flames of Euroscepticism, whipping up the Tory heartlands like right-wing Viagra. He lied about bendy bananas being banned. He lied about condom sizes being standardised. He lied about snails being designated as fish. He was reported to be Margaret Thatcher's favourite journalist, which is a bit like being the favoured gingerbread supplier to the witch in Hansel and Gretel. Johnson described his time in Brussels as chucking rocks over the garden wall, listening to this amazing crash from the greenhouse next door over in England as everything I wrote in Brussels was having this amazing explosive effect on the Tory party, and it really gave me this rather weird sense of power. It was this sense of power that led him to lie and to lie again, eventually being charged with being a proponent of fake journalism in the 1990s, which makes him a bit like Oscar Pistorius, the man without legs who became the first disabled athlete to murder his girlfriend. It was also in these fetid column inches that Johnson referred to Africans as pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. He also called homosexuals bum boys, absolutely proving himself to be a lazy caricaturist relying on stereotypes to make a point. While at the Telegraph, a recording of Johnson emerged, where he promises to give a journalist's address to an old friend, so said friend can go beat up said journalist. In the recording, Johnson asks,
how badly are you going to hurt this guy?
To which the reply is,
he will probably get a couple of black eyes and a cracked rib.
When Johnson's bosses at the Telegraph found out about this, all he got was a stern talking to. Bad criminal conspiracy, Boris. Bad! After the Telegraph, Boris became an MP for a few years. He rose within the Tory party to the ranks of vice chairman and shadow arts minister, both of which he was sacked from for lying about a mistress. For someone whose motto is having the cake and eating it too, he certainly has been fired a lot of times for having the cake and eating the pussy. Through his good mate and by then leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron, Johnson was appointed candidate for election for the Mayor of London. In an uncharacteristically disciplined race, Johnson won the election and began his first of 2 terms. Somewhat surprisingly, nothing really went wrong and his 8 years in charge went quite smoothly. Though you might say this is because he didn't really do very much. Though the Boris bikes weren't actually his idea, binning the bendy buses and bringing in the new, stiflingly hot route masters certainly was. The Olympics of 2012, again, nothing to do with Boris, did give him a chance to shine on a huge stage and bring his brand to every corner of the land. Johnson used this to enormous benefit. He quickly became the most popular politician in Britain. It also gave him the opportunity to fulfill a lifelong dream, to pop a stalk on in front of millions of women and children, all dangling from a zip wire. Though it is good to see him using protection. The only major blip came during the London riots. Johnson was on holiday during the riots and only came back after 3 days, like Jesus. His response was to buy 3 crowd control water cannons, which were subsequently banned, presumably because Christ on a Boris bike kept trying to make them wine cannons instead. By the time of the Brexit campaign, Johnson had returned to Parliament as an MP. Apparently on the fence about whether to stay in or leave the EU, Johnson wrote 3 essays to sound out the arguments. One for in, one for out, and presumably one for shaking it all about, the horny bastard. In the end, he came out for leave. But why? Why would a fully paid up member of the elite, head boy at Eton, president of the Oxford Union, vote to leave the EU? One answer is that it suited him politically to be in a prominent position in the Leave campaign with very little risk. But another idea is that to him and his class, Boris rules Britain, not Brussels. So Johnson campaigned up and down the country on the battle bus, waving asparagus and lying to us. Most notably on the 350 million quid a week that could be spent on the NHS if we leave the EU. Someone recently tried to take Boris to court over this particular lie, but it got thrown out because apparently you can say whatever you want in this country if you're Boris. During the campaign, Johnson said Obama didn't like Brexit because of anti-British sentiment he got from his Kenyan ancestry, which is understandable given that Johnson himself has an inherited distrust of respecting women. Anyway, Leave won the referendum, leading the country out of the heart of darkness and into a clusterfuck. Here is Johnson on the day of the result. Woo! Get in! Yeah! I love it! Yeah! Woo! Woo! Yeah! Look at him celebrate! Wow! Yeah! Yeah! As both a prize and a punishment for winning the referendum, Johnson was then thrust into the limelight on the world stage as Foreign Secretary. As Foreign Sec, he travelled the globe insulting everyone and everything. He had already got pretty good practice, like when he had gone to Iraq and then left it without paying his bar tab, or when he called Hillary Clinton the sadistic nurse on a mental health ward, which is a disgusting comparison. I mean, Nurse Ratched never invaded Libya. As Foreign Secretary on a trip to Myanmar, Johnson started reciting the poem Road to Mandalay, written by Rudyard Kipling, the man who coined the term white man's burden, which I guess Johnson understood to mean that as a white man, he should be a fucking burden. In another classic gaffe, Johnson described holidaymaker turned state prisoner Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe's activities in Iran as teaching journalism, which immediately got her locked up for twice as long, as that was the exact opposite of what Johnson had been asked to say. In his defence, Johnson wouldn't know journalism unless it slapped him on the cock. Johnson resigned shortly afterwards, not because of his many gaffes and fuck-ups, but in protest against the EU withdrawal agreement that Theresa May had just negotiated. In a rare moment of principle, Bojo resigned, protesting leaving the EU, saying instead of leaving the EU, we should be leaving the EU. Inspiring stuff. After resigning as Foreign Secretary, the lack of attention must have made his brain boil because he used his column in the Telegraph to describe burqa wearers as burglars and letterboxes. In the race to replace Theresa May as Prime Minister, Johnson immediately leapt to first place as the man to beat. A surprising frontrunner, given that he runs on his legs. In the first of the candidates' debates, Johnson was absent, taking only the form of a lectern in front of the void, helpfully giving us a representation of his policies. Interestingly, while the others debated, a takeaway was seen delivered to his house. He does seem like a man who never does much eating out. For the BBC debate, Johnson was present but rhetorically empty. He was neither a charismatic leader nor substantially different, offering nothing of his usual bluster or humour. You're left wondering, well, what was all the fuss about? Is that it? Is that the real Boris? It's true that he will still probably win by a mile, as thousands of demented skeletons use their last will and testament to vote for the candidate who speaks the most Latin. We know that he's an opportunist and a liar and a self-promoter of his one-man brand. But that's why he might be malleable and open to doing good things if someone tells him they'll make him popular. Let's just pray he hangs out with sensible people, which, as he hangs out with far-right ghoul Steve Bannon and has to pick a cabinet out of these morons, we know he can't. That's been Who's News. If you've liked it, please subscribe.